Imagine hunting someone for 20 years. Not because they're still dangerous, not because they're plotting against you, but because letting them live free somewhere out there breathing the same air, that's an insult you can't tolerate. Rome spent 2 decades tracking an old man across the Mediterranean, kingdom to kingdom, hideout to hideout, never resting until they'd backed him into a corner with nowhere left to run. This is the story of how the greatest general in history spent his final years as the world's most wanted fugitive. After Zama crushed his dreams of defeating Rome, Hannibal did something nobody expected. He didn't disappear into bitter retirement. He didn't drink himself to death lamenting his failures. He became a politician. And not just any politician. In 196 BC, at 46 years old, Carthage elected him Safit, their highest civilian office. Chief Magistrate. The man who'd terrified Rome for 15 years was now in charge of balancing budgets and collecting taxes. What he discovered made his blood boil more than any battlefield defeat ever had. The same wealthy merchant families who'd refused to send him reinforcements during the war, the oligarchs who'd let him bleed alone in Italy while they counted their profits, were now systematically looting Carthage's treasury. They'd rigged the tax system so the rich paid almost nothing while ordinary citizens were crushed under impossible burdens just to pay Rome's tribute. Every coin that should have gone to Rome was being siphoned into private bank accounts. And the people? They were being taxed into starvation to cover the gap. Hannibal looked at this corruption and saw something worse than Roman legions. At least Rome fought you face to face. So he went to war again. Not with swords this time, with audits and tax reforms. He exposed which families had been stealing, how much they'd taken, where they'd hidden it. He restructured the entire tax system to make the wealthy pay their actual share. He reorganized the government to strip the oligarchs of the power they'd been abusing for decades. And it worked. Within a single year, Carthage was solvent. They were paying Rome's tribute without bleeding the common people dry. The economy was recovering. The streets were buzzing with hope for the first time since the war ended. The regular citizens loved Hannibal like they'd never loved him before. He wasn't just their general anymore, he was their champion against the parasites who'd been feeding on them. The oligarchs he'd exposed? They hated him with a fury that made Rome's hatred look like mild annoyance. Because Hannibal had done something unforgivable. He'd proven they were unnecessary. That Carthage could thrive without their corruption. That all their wealth was built on theft from their own people. Drop your answer in the comments. Was Hannibal right to fight corruption this aggressively? Or should he have just stayed in his lane as a retired general? Because what those wealthy families did next proves that sometimes your real enemies aren't across the battlefield, they're sitting right next to you at the Senate. In 195 BC, a delegation of Carthaginian aristocrats made the journey to Rome. These were the same families Hannibal had humiliated by exposing their embezzlement. The same people who now saw their wealth and power slipping away because one stubborn general refused to let them steal in peace. They arrived in Rome with an accusation designed to destroy him completely. They claimed Hannibal was secretly plotting with Antiochus III, the Seleucid king who ruled a massive empire stretching from Turkey to Persia. They said Hannibal was using his position in Carthage's government to plan a new war against Rome, coordinating with Antiochus to launch simultaneous attacks that would finally bring Rome to its knees. Was it true? Maybe. Probably. Hannibal definitely maintained contacts all across the Mediterranean. He absolutely still hated Rome, that was no secret to anyone. Whether he was actually plotting a full-scale rebellion or whether the oligarchs completely fabricated the story to get rid of him, we'll never know for certain. But here's what matters: Rome believed it. Or at least they pretended to believe it, which amounts to the same thing. They sent an official demand to Carthage: surrender Hannibal Barca for trial in Rome. Let's be clear about what trial in Rome actually meant. This wasn't going to be a fair hearing where evidence was presented and justice was served. This was Hannibal being dragged through the streets in chains while 70,000 ghosts from Cannae screamed for his blood. This was a show trial where the verdict was decided before he entered the room. This was public execution, probably strangulation in the Tullianum prison after they'd paraded him through the city during a triumph so every Roman citizen could spit on the monster who'd haunted their nightmares for 15 years. There would be no mercy, no appeal, no chance. Hannibal learned about Rome's demand before it was officially delivered. Someone tipped him off, maybe a sympathetic official, maybe a spy, maybe just a friend who saw what was coming. He had hours, maybe less, to make a decision that would define his final years. Surrender and die in Roman chains? Or run and spend whatever time remained as a fugitive, always moving, never safe, hunted by an empire that never forgot and never forgave? He was 47 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life fighting Rome. He'd won battles that should have been impossible and lost a war that should have been winnable. He'd crossed the Alps with elephants, slaughtered Roman armies for sport, and come within a whisper of ending Rome's existence. And now it came down to this: die on their terms or live on his own. He chose flight. Hannibal disappeared from Carthage in 195 BC like smoke in the wind. He took whatever wealth he could carry, gold, gems, anything portable and valuable, and maybe a handful of loyal followers who preferred exile to staying behind. He left everything else: his property, his position, his homeland, the city he'd fought his entire life to protect. He'd spent most of his adult life away from Carthage anyway, bleeding in Italy for a cause that Carthage itself barely supported. Now he'd spend whatever years remained away from Carthage for an entirely different reason, because going home meant death. He sailed east to Tyre, then pushed on to Antioch, searching for the protection of Antiochus III. The Seleucid Empire was vast, powerful, wealthy, controlling territory from the Mediterranean coast all the way to Persia, commanding armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, sitting on treasuries that made Rome's wealth look modest. If anyone in the Mediterranean could challenge Rome head-on, it was Antiochus. Hannibal presented himself as Rome's ultimate enemy, offering to share everything he knew about Roman tactics, their weaknesses, their strategic thinking, their military psychology. He proposed a plan so audacious it sounded insane: give him 100 ships and 10,000 soldiers, and he'd invade Italy from the sea while Antiochus invaded from the east. Force Rome to fight on two fronts simultaneously, split their armies, divide their resources, stretch them until they snapped. It was vintage Hannibal thinking. Bold, strategically brilliant, requiring significant resources and absolute trust. Antiochus welcomed Hannibal to his court with all the honors due to history's most famous general. But he didn't trust him enough to actually implement the plan. Look at it from Antiochus's perspective. Here's this legendary commander offering to help, but he's also old, defeated, a refugee with no army and no power base. He's got nothing but his reputation and his memories. How much could he really contribute? So Antiochus gave Hannibal advisory positions. He consulted him on strategy. He listened to his ideas in planning meetings. But when war with Rome actually erupted in 192 BC, Antiochus didn't give Hannibal independent command or the resources to execute his proposed invasion of Italy. Instead, Hannibal got handed command of a small fleet in one minor naval engagement. And he lost. It was his only recorded naval defeat in history, and it must have stung like acid. The tactical genius who'd outmaneuvered Roman armies for 15 years, now reduced to commanding ships in a meaningless skirmish that nobody would remember. Mostly Hannibal just watched. He watched Antiochus make strategic mistakes he would never have made. He watched Roman legions defeat Seleucid armies through superior discipline and better tactics. He watched his one chance to strike back at Rome evaporate because his new patron was too cautious to actually use him. Imagine being the greatest general alive and having to watch someone else lose a war you know you could have won. The war ended exactly as badly as Hannibal probably predicted. Rome defeated Antiochus in multiple engagements and forced him to sign a humiliating peace treaty in 188 BC. Lost territory, massive tribute payments, complete strategic defeat. But Rome added one specific clause to that treaty, a demand they'd included just for him. Antiochus must surrender Hannibal Barca to Roman custody. They hadn't forgotten. They'd fought an entire war partly to get their hands on the refugee Antiochus had been sheltering. And now that Antiochus was defeated, he had no choice but to comply. Rome wanted their prize. Except Hannibal, who'd been expecting exactly this scenario, had already vanished. At 54 years old, he was running again. He traveled to Crete briefly, a few months hiding among pirates and merchants. Then Armenia, where the mountains offered temporary cover. Finally to Bithynia, a small kingdom in northern Anatolia along the Black Sea coast. King Prusias I welcomed him and actually put him to work designing fortifications, advising on military matters, commanding troops in local conflicts with neighboring kingdoms. For a few years, Hannibal had something resembling normal life. He helped Prusias win minor wars against rival kingdoms. He designed the defenses of several cities, fortifications that probably still exist in some form. He maybe even commanded troops in small engagements, winning victories that went unrecorded because they involved kingdoms so minor that nobody in Rome or Carthage even cared they existed. But Rome's network of spies, diplomats, and informants kept tracking him. Every kingdom that sheltered Hannibal received diplomatic pressure. Every ruler who employed him got quiet reminders that Rome never forgot its enemies and had very long memories when it came to settling scores. The message was clear: protect Hannibal and eventually we'll come for you too. By 183 BC, Hannibal was 63 years old. He'd lived in exile for 12 years, moving from kingdom to kingdom, court to court, always staying one step ahead of Rome's demands for extradition. 12 years of looking over his shoulder. 12 years of wondering when they'd finally corner him. He built himself a house in Bithynia with a feature that tells you everything about his mental state. 7 secret exits. 7 separate escape routes, each leading in a different direction. Every door could be used for quick flight. Every window was positioned for emergency escape. The man who'd once commanded 100,000 soldiers now lived alone in a paranoid fortress designed for one purpose: running. He slept lightly. Always ready. Always listening. He knew they were coming. It was only a question of when. Rome sent Titus Quinctius Flamininus, the same general who defeated Antiochus years earlier, to Bithynia with a message for King Prusias. Not a request. A demand: surrender Hannibal or face Rome's very serious displeasure. And when Rome expressed serious displeasure to small kingdoms, those kingdoms tended to stop existing shortly afterward. Prusias looked at Rome's power on one side of the scale and his loyalty to an elderly refugee on the other. The math was simple. Brutal but simple. He agreed to hand Hannibal over. He sent soldiers to arrest him. When Hannibal woke up that morning in 183 BC, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The sounds were off. Too quiet in some places, too loud in others. That specific kind of silence that settles right before violence explodes. He checked his 7 escape routes. Every single one was blocked. Soldiers at every door, every window, every possible exit. They'd learned from past failures. This time they'd made absolutely certain he couldn't slip away. Hannibal was 63 years old. Too old to fight his way through armed soldiers. Alone, without loyal troops to create a diversion. There was no clever tactical solution this time. No brilliant maneuver that could save him. He could surrender. Accept the chains. Endure being transported to Rome like captured cargo. Suffer through the triumph where they'd parade him through the streets so crowds could finally see the monster they'd feared for 40 years brought low. Then execution, probably strangulation in the Tullianum prison, the traditional end for Rome's most dangerous enemies. The same prison where they'd killed other generals who dared challenge Rome. Or he could make one final choice on his own terms. Hannibal had carried poison for years. Some sources say hidden in a ring, others claim in a hollow walking stick. It was insurance, preparation for exactly this moment. For the day when all the escape routes closed and only one door remained. According to the ancient sources, his final words were delivered with perfect Hannibal contempt. Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. Sarcasm. Mockery. Even at the absolute end, with death seconds away, he refused to give Rome the satisfaction they'd been craving for 2 decades. He drank the poison. Died within minutes. Alone in a foreign land, thousands of miles from the Carthage he'd left as a young man and the Italy he'd terrorized for 15 years. No funeral. No ceremony. No crowds of mourners. Just an old man denying his enemies their final victory. When the soldiers finally broke down the doors, they found only a corpse. They'd been sent to capture Rome's greatest enemy alive. Instead, they found a dead old man who cheated them one last time. Even in death, Hannibal won. Here's something that still gives me chills. By strange coincidence, Scipio Africanus, the only general who ever defeated Hannibal in battle, died the exact same year, 183 BC. He was 53 years old, forced into bitter retirement by political enemies who'd accused him of corruption. The man who'd saved Rome was betrayed by the very state he'd rescued. The 2 greatest generals of their age, rivals who'd shaped the entire Mediterranean world, who'd fought the most consequential battle in ancient history, both dying within months of each other. One in exile by his own hand. The other in disgrace, abandoned by his own people. But Hannibal's death didn't end the story. Rome never forgot. Never forgave. And 50 years after Hannibal drank that poison, they would return to Carthage to finish what he'd started. The complete and total annihilation of the city itself. Not just defeat. Not just conquest. Total destruction. Erasure from existence. But that's a story for next time.